COVID kind of pushed us into the future, probably 5 years, is voluntary benefits. They're evolving rapidly. And I think they're going to continue to evolve. What are some of the changes that you're seeing that you really like that voluntary is going through, or some of the changes?
Absolutely. So there's kind of, the first thing that comes to mind, there's two things that I think that are happening at the same time that are really helping one another. And one has to do with just all the different technology components that are coming together. I mean, this has been happening for years, but I do think we're at a point where it's certainly at its peak and will continue to rise in a lot of ways. Technology, and particularly the concepts of consolidated billing, not just Ben admin systems and what they can do and to enhance education. They're seeing a lot of good stuff around that, but the ability to make the programs work more smoothly behind the scenes, so whether it be consolidated billing and all of those kinds of components of administration being a little bit smoother, all the portaling capability that whether it be a carrier trying to provide a really good access point on their side or in that Ben admin environment. So I think those are all great, and that where it's meeting the market, I think the best is the ability to introduce products like in the non-traditional categories, products that maybe wouldn't get as much spotlight. I obviously have a little bias towards things like identity protection and all that, but all the other things that we've seen around student loan reimbursement, all those they're really good programs for people as long as they're introduced at the right time. And I think technology, if it weren't for that, we obviously wouldn't have the ability to bring some of these things together. It would just be too arduous for the HR department. But I think the merger of those two things is one thing in terms of delivery that I think are great. I think we're seeing interesting things on the traditional product side too, but it's really more the delivery and all that. The next thing that really jumps to mind for me though, going through this, it's just been a constant conversation, is the concept of claims. So if you look at the full life cycle of any voluntary benefit, a lot of people will liken that to first bill, right? We hear that a lot, behind the scenes when you're working to strategize different things and build out a good program. A lot of times it's this concept of, well, we got to get the brokers on board, and the brokers bring the employers on board, and then you have to have a smooth implementation. And once we get to that first bill, we'll be feeling good. And the reality is, what tells the biggest story, and not everybody's going to experience it. I think that's why, is because now you've got it to where that's everybody's universal experience at least. But then you are going to have that population of the group that has a claim, right? And that can go 10 different ways, right? If it doesn't go smoothly, client hears about it, broker hears about it, you can forget working with that broker again if you're in the carrier seat, right? And claims, we've been telling companies for years, you have to be claim-centric to be involuntary. That was a big switch for group-oriented and medical companies. It's a different hat they've got to wear. It's sort of a different culture you got to live. But then you get past the willingness to look at that differently, and then you got capability issues. And obviously, one of the biggest conversations that's being had around this now is how do we make that easier for the employee? It was 5 years ago, it was, can they submit things online and get things started like that, which frankly, some are still coming. Yeah, some are still coming around to getting off faxing and mailing and different things like that, having those options. And right at the time that's becoming a standard, you've got people talking about, well, can we integrate it, right? And the medical companies starting that first. Can we look at what is a wonderful source of knowledge to whether or not there's a claim there is any kind of medical evidence that would tell us if something meets that measure. And it's something the medical companies have talked about. Now we've got a lot of non-medical carriers saying, hey, we're going to find a way to do this too. So that experience that the employees can have around benefits end to end, right? Making enrollment as easy as we can, but then having that claim come to fruition. I think that's going to create a lot of distance between people in the market and up the game ultimately.
I think those are going to be the biggest differentiators myself as well. Thank you. That was a lot. That was fantastic, by the way. And so you have the front end, you have the implementation, paying that first bill, which is probably still where a lot of experiences are not amazing yet. And there's several reasons for that, right? Just the simplicity to put it on a platform and enroll. Some carriers are really good at that and some are just not great. And then billing.
that, you know, employers are still showing in our data top 3 issues, right? Getting new products on to platforms, right? Which I think that's working itself out better all the time, but it's not going to be perfect. There's just too many systems and there's too many carriers, so there's always going to be some work to be done. That's a leading issue, and then billing. Yeah, billing issues are the first sign of trouble, obviously, but right behind it is claims. And I think again, it's not necessarily a lesser issue. Maybe it's less frequent just by the numbers, and in many instances, it's a much bigger issue. So, you know, if you look at it from the perspective of a lot of people focus on, I know for you guys, it's a very holistic look. You probably agree. A lot of brokers, I think, get hung up a little bit on product, and it feels like more and more people, as they're getting to work with outfits like you and Eric and others that focus on the right stuff, I think let's look at what people are going to deal with. Undoubtedly, product's important, but undoubtedly there's going to be billing. Undoubtedly there's enrollment. There's all these other components. So let's make sure we're solving for those. And does our carrier evaluation process include those issues sufficiently, right? And claims now, I think it's just one that's going to change. It's not going to be just about how quickly do you pay claims, you know, that kind of thing. How do they submit? It's going to go to the next level pretty quickly. Mm-hmm.
Well, claims can make or break you later, especially if it's the owner of the company or right? A friend of the CEO, right? And right. We've seen this happen, and some carriers are just really good at claims and some aren't. And here's where we find a lot of the claims get hung up is it might not even be the carrier's fault. It might just be some miscommunication somewhere or missing piece of data, or they didn't get the fax. We just heard that like, who faxes anymore? But that's what happens. And so I think one way to circumvent that is to make sure that they have the resources beyond the carrier direct. And that's one of the big changes that we're seeing happen. And whether it's our broker partners giving it that secondary resource or it's our team, but still making sure the carrier does well and then making sure there's that support because everybody wants to be heard. Yeah, and absolutely. Oh my gosh, we just went through a claim with the carrier, which I will not name. It might have been with an owner. And it should have been a simple claim and it took weeks and weeks to pay. Well, why does this happen? Well, they got us involved. We got it paid faster. And it was just, there was a little thing missed. And admittedly, the carrier did a horrible job at telling them. They didn't tell them anything. They just get a rejection letter in the mail, which I think is the worst. They called up fuming and sure. Thank goodness they called us. But I think that carriers they have to get better at that. They have to get rid of the red tape. And I think, interesting enough, I think some of this transparency that's going to happen in the future is going to actually make it much easier to file claims too.
Absolutely. You're right. That word's going to find itself into voluntary in a bunch of different ways. You know, it gets talked about on the medical side of things so much, but it's gonna find its way in a lot more. And you're right, that you're really touching on there is what when we talk to carriers about triaging, right? Making sure that, okay, you don't have everything you need to know about the claim to go one way or the other. Well, let's ask the question. There's timelines for all of that. And it's like the ultimate bad day when you have those things cascade, not only to where any individual has an experience like that, but when it's an owner or somebody in the HR department, it just shines such a light on it. So it's an area everybody's got to have their ducks in a row for sure.
Yes, and again, there are some carriers that do better there. But you know what? It's everything now. Wouldn't you agree? Because if the front end isn't good, nobody gets to the claim process.
Yep.
If it's not easy to enroll. And there are some carriers that might say they're amazing at technology. They're just a little bit behind. So it's very complicated to enroll in a simple accident plan. And I think that's going to change. I think it has to.
Yep. Now, there are so many places you could talk about, like the process and the mechanics. Again, I mean, another one you just set off in my head is going back to enrollment and implementation. We had a carrier not but 6 months ago that we worked with who is still in the process of doing implementation calls post-enrollment. So everything up to enrollment was sort of done via email, and there was some involvement with sales, setting some things up, and then the implementation was done after that. And they really were focused on billing and some other things. Well, and the attitude was, Nick, we haven't sent the first bill yet. And look, I mean, I don't want to be preachy about it, but to take implementation just as billing and not treat it as we want to do everything right end to end, right? So let's talk about how this program is going to go. Let's have a checklist for it all. Let's make sure the client understands that communication is so important. And I think the carriers that are shining through are the ones that can approach that the right way. And different brokers need different levels of support. I think, there are probably plane carriers that your operation can work with, and it's maybe a different checklist on their side because you're managing it. But to have something like that be that far down the road, a billing call after enrollment when EDI is already presumably happening, and that's going to feed so much of the billing knowledge that the carrier has. So yeah, there's all these different like pieces of the equation that all of that leads to customer experience, whether it's the employer or the employee, and making sure that you've got the right timetable for it's critical.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm actually very excited to see what some of these changes are in the future, and it's getting easier and easier to place different carriers and those that get it. That especially some of the ones that maybe are a little less known as well have been very adaptive. As long as they have everything in a row, we've seen a lot of good experience with them. The other thing that we've seen that's changed drastically is actually two pieces. It's what's in the policy. So providing more coverage and reducing the cost. So we have more clients that actually changed carriers in the past 12 months than even implemented something new because product design tied with the simplification of enrolling is just getting better.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not an actuary, and I won't try to profess a lot in terms of all the details and pricing, but I know one big influence on that. I mean, you've already alluded to a big one around enrollment, changing things and all that. But one undeniable thing is there are many, many more carriers in this space. There's at least 80 people in voluntary. It depends on exactly how you want to define the number and the cutoff, or do I have some products that I could call voluntary all the way to that's all I really do. You're in that ballpark, right? And some are regional, some are super regional, some focus on different markets. But all of that coupled with all the experience, years and years of experience across the industry now that other professionals can look at it, I think has just put a ton of pressure on those products. And obviously now you've got GI is like a really common thing, right? It's extremely common to just say, look, I know we could offer more, but do we really need to offer more? Is that going to complicate things even beyond what's necessary for the employee? Is that too much coverage for them? And looking at things through that guaranteed issue lens has changed so much of the post effective date process, right? It's installed, it's done. We don't have a lot of that UI going on. So that's another thing that I think as you just look at that baseline and say, okay, let's decomplicate this a little bit, changes pricing, but a ton of pressure to add benefits while keeping prices low. And the whole, what you're alluding to, carriers, which is the whole concept of a takeover, and that all gets lumped into the concept of takeovers, right? I mean, I remember 5 years ago, it kind of had a bad connotation. And now the reality is, no, it's not. They were talking before about, well, we're swapping product for other reasons. Now it's happening because products are antiquated, right? And that's right. What you're finding is you're going in and you're seeing a product in a program and you're saying, well, we can do better than that for you. Isn't that what we're supposed to do here? And so much of that is I think driving that is like the first thing on the checklist, right? Is okay, we can add another product, but before we do, let's make sure the ones you have are right for the group, right for the market.
Right. If they put it in 10 years ago, and they kept that carrier just because they had a good experience, which rightfully might be the right move, and you don't know unless you pull it apart. But if you have 2% participation in a group, and I'm seeing this all the time, 2% participation, the cost is double because they have a small group product for a large group.
You're absolutely right.
It's and even when you just put it down on paper now, it's amazing at how big the difference is becoming. And